Shir tonight should be Le'ilei Nishmas Gittel Bas Mordechai Halevi Chava Bas Avram Meir Devar Malka Bas Yitzchak. The Neshama should have an Aliyah. A Rashi that we're all familiar with, but perhaps struggle with understanding the full significance and depth of what Rashi intends to tell us right at the beginning of this week's Parsha. Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe leimar. Rabbi Shalom tells Moshe Rabbeinu, of course, preceding the mitzvah of Binyan HaMishkan. Daber el bnei Yisrael v'yikchu li truma. Speak to Bnei Yisrael and take for me truma me'ez kol ish asher yidvena libai tikchu as truma si. Again, a medrash that we're all familiar with. The question is that Rashi, we know, says that li, what does it mean? V'yikchu li truma, you should take for me truma. Obviously, Rashi's bothered by what exactly would be missing if we don't have this word li. What would be the problem if it just said v'yikchu truma? So Rashi adds in a word v'yikchu li lishmi. It should be seemingly lishma. And the Mefarshim are bothered, the Mefarshei Rashi, how does this help the problem? Meikara maikasavar lebasoif maikasavar. Whatever Rashi was bothered by, what is he adding by saying it has to be lishma? Obviously, whoever is giving to the Mishkan is doing it for the purpose of the Mishkan. In fact, the halachic need of lishma seems not to be so necessary, the Mefarshim point out. When it comes to the actual nesina of the truma, it didn't have to be necessarily lishma according to most Mefarshim. So what exactly is Rashi adding? What is he helping over here when he says v'yikchu li lishmi? I believe that Rashi over here is alluding to a very much deeper concept, but a concept which must be developed and understood. I think that Rashi is for us trying to uncover and decipher a medrash which, again, we may be familiar with, but a medrash which perhaps we don't appreciate the depth. We know that the medrash tells us that the Rebbeinu Shalom is mitzaveh us to build a Mishkan. But the Medrash says that the reason the Rebbeinu Shalom was mitzaveh Klal Yisrael to build a Mishkan, the Medrash says, Moshel l'maha davar doime. If you want to understand the tzivui, you want to understand the reasoning behind having to build a Mishkan, the Medrash says, I'll give you a Moshel. Moshel l'maha davar doime lemelech shahayisa leibas yechida, a king that had an only daughter. Bo echad hamelachim v'notla, a prince comes and marries this daughter. Bikish leilech le'arza lita le'ishto. Of course, the prince wants to go back home with his new wife. Omar lo, so the king says, Biti shenasati lecha yechidasi. This is my only daughter. Lifreish mimeni eni yachal. I simply can't be separate from her. Loimer lecha al titla, but I did not allow you to take her. Also eni yachal afishe ishtecha. After all, you married her. Elazu toiva asali shekol makom shata haylech kitain echad asali she'eder etzechem she'eni yachal aniach es biti. But do me a favor, wherever you go, wherever you take my daughter, build me a little place where I could dwell. That's what's going on at the beginning of this week's Parsha. We just concluded Matan Torah, the Rebbeinu Shalom comes to Klal Yisrael and says to them, Nasati lechem es haTorah, I gave you my bas yichida, I gave you my most precious asset. Lifrei sheimene ene yachal, I can't be separate from it. Loimer lechem al titlu ene yachal, but on the other hand, you live on earth, you're earthlings, therefore you have to take it with you. So what is the solution? Wherever you are, build a home for me that I could dwell near you, so that I could be close to the Torah. From this medrash and from many other midrashim, a medrash towards the beginning of Medrash Rabbi, also a medrash that we're familiar with, the Rashi says, the medrash says, "V'yikchu Tavu li truma ki lekach toiv nasati lachem teirasi al tazovu. Again, Chazal are presenting the obligation to build a Mishkan to be specifically on the heels of Matan Torah, almost as if there was a problem which arose because of Matan Torah that the Medrash is presenting as Keilu, the Rabbi Shalom, being separate from the Torah, whatever that means, and the Mishkan is going to help be the antidote. Al tazvoivu es hamekach shenasati lechem. I gave you the Torah. V'yesh lecha mekach shemishamachon nimkar imo. But says the Rabbi Shalom, I come along with the Torah. If you're going to take the Torah, build for me a Mishkan that I could dwell. Here again, we see Chazal are clearly insinuating to us that the Mishkan is here to help with an issue, that giving the Torah to us somehow, some way could have envisioned a separation. We could have created a separation between the Rabbeinu Shalom Kutchabrichu and the Torah, and the Mishkan is going to be the antidote. The question is, how do we understand this medrash? Abbas Yechida, the Rabbeinu Shalom gave us the Torah, therefore he's separate from the Torah, and now the Mishkan comes, and now the Rabbeinu Shalom is close to the Torah. How are we supposed to understand this? So l'chora, this is supposed to be what the Ramban is explaining to us. What the Ramban is coming to tell us. We know that there is a tremendous machlekes harishonim between the Ramban and the Rambam as to the purpose, the main function of Binyan HaMishkan and therefore Binyan HaMikdash. Is the main purpose of Binyan HaMishkan a continuation, as the Ramban says, of Matan Torah, of Har Sinai? In the words of the Rabban, is the main purpose of the Mishkan, Kasher Diber Hashem Im Yisrael, Pone Biponim, Aseres HaDibros, Vitziva Isama Yidei Moshe, K'tzas Mitzvos, K'moi Avos Mitzvah Yisrael, says the Ramban, V'lechein Tziva Tchila Al Dvar HaMishkan. The Mishkan is supposed to be She'yeh Loi Bayis B'soichem Mekudosh L'Sho V'sham Yedaber Im Moshe. It's a continuation of Matan Torah, a sort of a reenactment of Matan Torah, continuing to escort Klal Yisrael, or like the Rambam, that the main function of Mishkan and Beis HaMikdash is for the Avodah. Of course, the Lashon of the Rambam in multiple places is the function of Beis HaMikdash is to do the Avodah. This, in fact, is the understanding behind the machlekes between the Rambam and the Ramban in terms of minyan hamitzvahs. The Rambam doesn't count the kelim as a separate mitzvah because the Rambam understands the whole point of Beis HaMikdash is for the avodah. The kelim are just those items which are necessary to allow the Beis HaMikdash function. The Ramban takes issue with the Rambam because the Ramban doesn't view Beis HaMikdash, of course that's where you do the avodah, but primarily the Beis HaMikdash is a place of hashras hashchina. It's the Har Sinai that continues to dwell amongst Klal Yisrael. Of course, where you're going to do the avodah, if not for the makam where the hashras hashchina is. But the function of Beis HaMikdash primarily is not to do the avodah. The function of Beis HaMikdash primarily is hashras hashchina, not any hashras hashchina, but hashras hashchina, the likes of which we witnessed and experienced on Har Sinai. So the Ramban is telling us over here that Mishkan, Beis HaMikdash, is the continuation of Har Sinai. What that means is that the Beis HaMikdash and Mishkan is our connection to the Torah. Har Sinai was the revelation of the Torah to Klal Yisrael, the Rebbeinu Shalom revealing the Torah to Klal Yisrael. If Beis HaMikdash and Mishkan are a continuation of Har Sinai, that means that they are intertwined with the Torah. That's what the Medrash means to say, Ki lekach toiv nasati lachem. The Rebbeinu Shalom says, if I give you the Torah, I'm coming with the Torah, and therefore build a Mishkan. You're taking my Bas Yechida, therefore you have to build a Mishkan. Basically, you can't have a Kabbalah HaTorah, you can't have a Matan Torah without a Mishkan. But the Medrash seems to be insinuating even further than that. Not simply that the Hashras HaShechina which we experience at Matan Torah is the Hashras HaShechina which Klal Yisrael had traveling with them in the Mishkan, but what the Medrash seems to be telling us is even going a step further than that. And that is that there seems to have been somewhat of a danger, a concern. The Rebbeinu Shalom says, you took my Torah, I gave you my Torah, it's my Bas Yechida, Lifresh mimena I efsher. It's almost as if the Rebbeinu Shalom is saying, to have given you the Torah, there's a tremendous risk, there's a tremendous concern, and Chalila, if Matan Torah just turns into a memory, that it fades out in the background. So the Torah Chalila in the hands of Klal Yisrael could become separate from the Bari Olam himself. We could begin to distance the Torah and the Rebbeinu Shalom. We begin to cause a schism between the Torah and the one who gave us the Torah. And then the Torah just becomes a set of laws, Chalila v'chas. It becomes an intellectual exercise. Comes the Rebbeinu Shalom and says, I can't allow that. And how am I going to ensure that Limud HaTorah and the experience of Torah is always understood to be an experience of connecting with the divine, connecting with the Almighty, being a time where we have a rendezvous with the Rebbeinu Shalom, because the Torah is going to be always with me. I'm coming along with the Torah. Lifresh mimena iyavshar means that the Rebbeinu Shalom is telling Klal Yisrael, if you are going to take my Torah, it means that there always has to be a connection between the Torah and the Rebbeinu Shalom, so that you always appreciate that through the Limud HaTorah is the way that you're connecting with the Borei Olam. And therefore the Rebbeinu Shalom modeled the Mishkan in a way that we can't have a proper connection to the Torah. Our access to the Torah is going to be limited to the extent that we have a Beis HaMikdash. If we don't have Beis HaMikdash, we don't have Mishkan, our access to the Torah is going to be diminished, because then Chalila v'chas, the Torah turns into an enterprise. It turns into a goal in its own right. The Torah always has to be a way of accessing the Rebbeinu Shalom. And how did the Rebbeinu Shalom ensure that? That the way that we get to the Torah, the way that we have access to the Torah, is only through Beis HaMikdash, where the place of Hashras HaShechina. If we need Beis HaMikdash to understand the Torah, that means the Torah is always going to bring us back to Makam of Hashras HaShechina. And therefore, when we have Beis HaMikdash, we can understand the Torah. That's when Torah is complete. When we don't have Beis HaMikdash, then the Torah is incomplete. To ensure that the Rebbeinu Shalom is always one and the same, we can't have the Torah unless it's connecting us to the Rebbeinu Shalom. If we don't have access to the Rebbeinu Shalom because there's no Beis HaMikdash, then together with the loss of access to the Rebbeinu Shalom, we lose access to the Torah. And this should be very, very obvious to us. After all, what do we say multiple times a day? Yiratzayin she'ibana Beis HaMikdash. And then we continue. Don't you think that we shouldn't break up? We should say, why smack in the middle we say, because according to the Ramban, the main function of Beis HaMikdash is that we understand the Torah. It's our connection to the Torah. And as long as we don't have Beis HaMikdash, so that we don't have full understanding of the Torah. Yiratzin sheibana Beis HaMikdash, first and foremost. Why? Then you'll be able to give us a chelik in Torah. In fact, the Vilna Gaon writes that there are two places in Shas where Rabbeinu HaKadosh put this statement, Yiratzin sheibana Beis HaMikdash, after the end of Masechta. Of course, Masechta Tamid, it's all about the Beis HaMikdash. It makes a lot of sense. Yiratzin sheibana Beis HaMikdash. Where else? According to the Vilna Gaon, at the very end of Masechta Avos. We have a different girsa, but the Gaon's girsa was at the very end of Masechta Avos. Why? Avos is all about Kabbalah Torah. Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai. Rabbeinu HaKadosh ends off. We were Makabel Torah, but our access to the Torah now is limited because we don't have Beis HaMikdash. The Torah is not the same if we don't have access to Beis HaMikdash. Yiratzin sheibana Beis HaMikdash v'sein chalkeinu b'sarasecha. The last line, according to the Gra of Meseches Avos, Kabbalah Torah is diminished when we don't have access to Beis HaMikdash, because the Rebbeinu Shalom says, if you're going to have my Torah, you're going to have a place for me. There's never going to be a separation between me and my Torah. And if you don't have access to me because there's a Churban Abayis, then you don't have full access to the Torah. Perhaps the way this is most expressed, the Chassam Sofer, my father-in-law brings in his Sefer, he develops this idea beautifully, unbelievable Chassam Sofer. Chassam Sofer says in the beginning, in Meseches Nedarim, Daf Samach Vav, a very strange Gemara over there. We're all familiar with the Gemara. The Gemara tells the whole story about a husband and a wife that didn't speak the same language. And the Gemara in the middle of it, a garet over there, and the Gemara seems to say, over there that she comes, he tells her to do something on the doorpost, and she understood to do it to the neighbor. The neighbor was Baba ben Buta. The way the Chassam Sofer understands that Gemara, says the Chassam Sofer, Ha'emes nira shahayu ma'ashimim lebaba shahisi. What that Gemara is doing is taking Ben Baba ben Buta to task. Why is it taking him to task? Says the Chassam Sofer, because Baba ben Buta was the one who gave the Eitzah, the Klal Yisrael, to allow Hurdus to build Beis HaMikdash. V'ra'apela ki kosav ki mitzion teitei Torah. And the fact that Hurdus built Beis HaMikdash, u'bavoneseinu ha'rabim miyoim shenivne ba'yishene odei rishon koresh nistama ha'nevuah miyoim shenivne binyan ma'mefureh odei Hurdus ha'eved oz nechlu beisham beisil. From the time that we allowed a guy to be involved, we allowed Hurdus to be involved in Beis HaMikdash, it was sullied Beis HaMikdash. Beis HaMikdash was no longer pure, it was no longer pristine. You know what happens when you don't have a pure Beis HaMikdash? It affects the Torah. From that moment onward, says the Chassam Sofer, Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai began to argue. Nisrabu machlokes bi Yisrael. Because if we don't have full access to the Rebbeinu Shalom, if we don't have Kiton, if the Beis HaMikdash is not perfect, so then the Torah is not perfect as well. Yirotzen she'ibana Beis HaMikdash, v'sein chelkeinu b'seirasecha. The purpose, Parshas Truma, the Medrash is telling us is after Kabbalas HaTorah. The Rebbeinu Shalom says, now that you have the Torah, there's a condition. The Torah always has to be understood and experienced in a way that it brings you to a higher spiritual level, it brings you closer to me. If it's not going to bring you closer to me, then you don't have the Torah. So as long as you have a place for me, a place to connect for me, the Torah will be sprouting forth from Beis HaMikdash, and it will always connect you to the Rebbeinu Shalom. The minute there's no Beis HaMikdash, so that causes a chesaron in the Torah. To understand Torah fully, we need full access to Rebbeinu Shalom. We need a Beis HaMikdash. This, I believe, is the depth of what Rashi means. Rashi says, "V'yikchu li truma." What does Rashi say? Li lishmi. We say it doesn't have to be lishma. What does Rashi mean to add lishmi? What is the Shem Hashem B'Lashon Chazal? The Ramban tells us in his Akdama to Torah, Kol HaTorah Kula Shmoisav Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Every word of Torah is a Shem Hashem. That's why the Gemara refers to Psukim as Loimin Hashem Hu. The entire Torah is Shmoisav Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. After all, says the Ramban, Ki Shem Hashem Ekra V'Goydel Elokeinu. How do we know that you have to make Birchas HaTorah? Ki Shem Hashem Ekra. When I say the name of Hashem, when do I say the name of Hashem? When I learn Torah. Kol HaTorah Kula Shmoisav Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What is Rashi saying? V'yikchu li lishmi. Build a Beis HaMikdash, build a Mishkan for my name. What's the Rebbeinu Shalom's name? The Torah. Build a Beis HaMikdash for the Torah. Build a Mishkan for the Torah, because Torah can't be complete unless there is a Mishkan, unless there is a Beis HaMikdash. Rashi is deciphering for us what Chazal have already told us. That the Rebbeinu Shalom at the beginning of Parshas Truma says, now that you got the Torah, it's time for you to build a small Kiton Katan Cheder Shali Vani Adar B'Soicha. If you want to have the Torah, you have to have a place for the Rebbeinu Shalom to reside. The reason there's Binyan Beis HaMikdash and Binyan HaMishkan is to have a complete Kabbalas HaTorah, to enhance the Kabbalas HaTorah that we had in Parshas Yisro, Parshas Mishpatim. Rashi says right at the beginning, V'yikchu li truma, li lishmi. Why are you building this? Why are you beginning this entire process of Binyan HaMishkan? Lishmi, for my shame, for Torah. To understand Torah fully is going to have to be a kiton, a cheder for the Rebbeinu Shalom to reside. That's the understanding. V'osu li mikdash v'sachanti b'socha. Make a Beis HaMikdash, make a Mishkan. Because without that, the Torah is going to be lacking. Without that, the Torah is going to be missing. Yirotzen she'ibana Beis HaMikdash v'sein chalkeinu b'seirasecha.